Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to declare open the 27th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Friends, let me begin by thanking our friends here in Egypt for such a warm welcome. My team and I know just how demanding hosting such a conference is and how many people have worked incredibly hard to get us to this point. So congratulations and thank you again. Now, as the UK's presidency comes to an end, I want to reflect on what we achieved together in Glasgow, and also what has happened since in our presidency year. Last November, the world gathered at COP26 against a fractured and fractious geopolitics as a once-in-a-century pandemic dragged mercilessly on. And yet, leaders recognized that despite their differences, often profound, cooperation on climate and nature is in our collective self-interest. And thanks to that spirit of cooperation and compromise, we forged together the Glasgow Climate Pact. Collectively, we achieved something historic and something hopeful. With your help, we closed the Paris Rulebook. We made unprecedented progress on coal and on fossil fuel subsidies. We committed to rapidly scale up finance and to double adaptation finance by 2025. We reiterated the urgency of action and support for loss and damage and established serious work on funding arrangements. And we hope that that has paved the way for a formal agenda item and tangible progress here in Egypt. And every party, and I repeat this, every party agreed to revisit and strengthen their 2030 emission reduction targets to align with Paris. So I want to thank the 29 countries which have already updated their NDCs since Glasgow. From Australia to Micronesia, India to Vanuatu, Norway to Gabon. And we also made progress outside the negotiating rooms with commitments from business, from finance, from philanthropy. Friends, thanks to the work that we did together, we achieved our objective, the goal at the heart of the Paris Agreement. We kept 1.5 degrees alive. Now, none of us could have anticipated the year that followed. We have been buffeted by global headwinds that have tested our ability to make progress. Putin's brutal and illegal war in Ukraine has precipitated multiple global crises: energy and food insecurity, inflationary pressures, and spiraling debt. And these crises have compounded existing climate vulnerabilities and the scarring effects of the pandemic. And yet, despite this context, there has been some progress in implementing the commitments that we delivered in Glasgow. Over 90% of the global economy is now covered by a net zero target, up from less than 30% when the UK took on the COP26 role. The biggest companies and the financial institutions in the world have committed to net zero. They've done so in force, with a global wall of capital creating green jobs and directing billions into the green industries of both today and tomorrow. Countries and companies are making tangible sectoral progress, from zero-emission vehicles to our breakthrough agenda, and are accelerating the rollout of renewable energy across the world. And the Secretary-General has been clear. Our shared long-term futures do not lie in fossil fuels. And I agree with him wholeheartedly. Every major report published Every major report published this year underscores the point that progress is being made. And thanks to the commitments that we garnered ahead of and at COP26, and indeed in our presidency year, emissions in 2030 are expected to be around 6 gigatons lower. That is the equivalent of 12% of today's global annual emissions. And with full implementation of all the commitments in place today, including NDCs and net zero targets, the reports suggest that we are heading to 1.7 degrees warming by the end of the century. Not 1.5, but still, progress. So to those who remain skeptical about the multilateral process, and of the COP process in particular, my message is clear. As unwieldy and sometimes as frustrating as these processes can be, the system is delivering. And there are many people to thank for that, and certainly too many to name. The prime ministers and the presidents who have sensed the changing wind and indeed sought instead to harness it. The ministers to the miners who have recognized a just and sustainable future can only be delivered with a clean energy transition. The civil society organizations, youth representatives, and indigenous peoples who pushed us to consider and reconsider what was possible in Glasgow have continued to do so since. And of course, the brilliant officials, the brilliant civil servants around the world, not least in the UK's COP unit, who have helped to deliver progress. And yet, despite this progress, I fully recognize the scale of the challenge still in front of us. Just as every report shows that we are making some progress, they're equally clear that there is so much more to be done in this critical decade. Friends, we are not currently on a pathway that keeps 1.5 in reach. And whilst I do understand that leaders around the world have faced competing priorities this year, we must be clear. As challenging as our current moment is, inaction is myopic and can only defer climate catastrophe. We must find the ability to focus on more than one thing at once. How many more wake-up calls do world leaders actually need? A third of Pakistan underwater, the worst flooding in Nigeria in a decade. This year, the worst drought in 500 years in Europe, in 1,000 years in the US, and the worst on record in China. The cascading risks are also clear. Entire economic sectors becoming unsustainable and uninsurable, entire regions becoming unlivable, and the strain on the global movement of goods and the pressure of people to relocate because of the climate crisis becoming almost unimaginable. So this conference must be about concrete action. And I hope that when the world leaders join us today, they will explain clearly what their countries have achieved during the last year and how they will go further. It is very simply a matter of trust. Without its constituent members delivering on their commitments and agreeing to go further, the entire system falters. I will do everything in my power to support our Egyptian friends, and the UK is here to reach ambitious outcomes across the agenda, including on mitigation, on adaptation, on loss and damage. And we know that we have reached a point where finance makes or breaks the program of work that we had ahead of us. So whilst I would point to some of the progress shown on the $100 billion, I hear the criticisms, and I agree that more must be done by governments and by the multilateral development banks, including on doubling adaptation finance by 2025 and establishing a post-2025 goal. Ultimately, though, I remain hopeful. Look back to where we were before Glasgow. Look back to where we were before Paris. Indeed, as we mark the 30th anniversary, look back to where we were before Rio. With thanks to all of you, the UK's presidency ends as a demonstration that progress is possible, it is happening, and it is continuing. Yes, we need to accelerate that progress in the remainder of the decisive decade, but I believe fundamentally that we can. We know what we need to do to keep 1.5 degrees alive. We know how to do it. And Sameh, you and your team have our full support. So now, friends, let's make sure we deliver. Let's make it happen. Thank you. So, distinguished delegates, I would like to invite you to turn to sub-item 2A of the provisional agenda for the session, titled Election of the President of the Conference of the Parties at its 27th session. You may recall that in accordance with Rule 22, paragraph 1 of the draft Rules of Procedure being applied, the office of the President of the Conference of Parties is subject to rotation amongst the 5 regional groups. We now continue the cycle with a president from the African states. So it gives me great pleasure to propose that the conference elect, by acclamation, His Excellency, Mr. Sameh Shukri, who will serve as president of the conference at its 27th session. I therefore declare His Excellency, Mr. Sameh Shukri, elected President of the 27th session of the Conference of the Parties. I congratulate Mr. Shukri on this election and wish him and his team every success in guiding the work of the conference. I now invite Mr. Shukri to take his seat at the podium. Welcome, Mr. President.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to Sharm el-Sheikh. I would like to welcome you all to this 27th session of the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC. As a COP president, allow me to express my thanks and appreciation to all of you for your confidence and trust placed in my country, Egypt, a confidence which was reflected by your choice of Egypt as a host country to this most important and biggest global event, as well as electing me to shoulder this huge responsibility, which I will fulfill whilst trusting that Egypt will receive your support in order to achieve together our goals. I confirm to you that Egypt shall spare no effort to achieve these goals, and we will work in order to ensure the best conditions, allowing all participants from all parties, governmental and non-governmental, to contribute to the success of this important event and to reach the results we all aim at. Allow me to also seize this opportunity to express my deepest appreciation to the United Kingdom government, the previous COP presidency, for all the efforts deployed during the presidency, as well as the efforts in order to promote climate action through the excellent performance by the UK presidency team led by my friend Secretary el-Sheikh. It was my pleasure to work with him for almost a year to ensure a smooth presidency handover, building on the political momentum of Glasgow last year, and to build upon the journey in order to reach the objectives we agreed upon and the results we aim at. Ladies and gentlemen, our conference, which starts today, is the 27th session in a 30-year journey we started together in the life of the UNFCCC. A journey that is continuous, that has proven to be relevant and important, and during which we became more cognizant of the threats that are around us, more aware of the science and the risk impacts revealed by science, and more convinced by what we should do in order to overcome these challenges and threats today and as of this moment. Egypt is determined to pursue this journey here in Sharm el-Sheikh so that our conference will become a milestone in a long journey of efforts and work so as to reach our final destination. To renew our commitments, to scale up our ambitions, and to seriously start the implementation and achieve collective bilateral action through efficiently dealing with humanity's biggest challenge in modern times. All types of evidence undoubtedly show that climate change is a real threat to people's lives, wherever they live and in all forms. Science proves that the development track humanity has endorsed since the Industrial Revolution and until recently is no longer sustainable, and that if it will continue without any radical change, future generations will definitely face more serious consequences compared to those witnessed by current generations. Despite all goodwill, despite all the serious efforts, science confirms once again and through various reports, namely the IPCC report. So science confirms that we are still facing growing gaps, whether keeping up with the Paris Accord climate target or adapting with the negative impacts of the climate change, or also providing necessary finance so that developing countries can fulfill their role. We have witnessed during this year painful events in Pakistan, in the African continent, and in various parts of Europe and America. All these events and their destruction and impact represent a lesson to be learned and a sounding alarm all over the planet, a wake-up call to inviting us to more precaution and to act quickly to take all necessary measures as per our commitments and pledges. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear to all of us that our conference is held this year amid political tensions that left their deep impact on all our countries, namely the crises in energy and food supplies. If some people think that such challenges will hamper international collective action in the field of climate action, on the contrary, we here in Sharm el-Sheikh need to prove the contrary. That's why I invite you all to show the whole world that we are aware of the challenge awaiting us and that we have the political will to counter it. That's why we have constantly called for moving from negotiations and pledges to an era of implementation as a priority, as well as the acceleration of implementation of what we have agreed upon with the UNFCCC, promoted in the Paris Accord and the work program, while mentioning the importance of scaling up ambitions according to the country's capacities and natures of their resources. I would like to commend the countries that have updated their NDCs, including Egypt, and I represent you all. I trust I speak on behalf of all of you when I call upon countries to do the same, especially that the NDC synthesis report revealed that the current level of ambitions is not up to the Paris goals. In this context, it is worth mentioning that for the sake of an efficient implementation of pledges and commitments, we need a more efficient and wider participation by all relevant parties from non-state actors, whose role is equally important to that of the role of the states, namely private sector, banks, international finance institutions, civil society, youth associations, indigenous associations, and others. In this context, my country, Egypt, while preparing this conference, has been adamant on engaging in consultations with all these parties, including them in all events and meetings, be it pertaining to the presidency initiatives or thematic days, or also the preparations for the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Summit, which will start its meetings tomorrow at the level of heads of states and governments.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I assume my presidency of the COP, I draw your attention to two undeniable facts. First, climate change-related efforts over the past decades were remarkably polarized, which has slowed down progress of the negotiations. Second, the current mobilization efforts raise many concerns. The $100 billion a year pledge has not yet been implemented. Also, the financing currently available focuses on curbing emissions and not adaptation efforts. Also, most of the financing is based on loans. I believe that you agree with me when I say that we do not have the luxury of continuing in this way. We have to change our approaches to this existential threat. We have to work diligently.
And until recently is no longer sustainable. And that if it will continue without any radical change, future generations will definitely face more serious consequences compared to those witnessed by current generations. Despite all goodwill, despite all the serious efforts, science confirms once again and through various reports, namely the IPCC report. So science confirms that we are still facing growing gaps, whether keeping up with the Paris Accord climate target or adapting with the negative impacts of the climate change, or also providing necessary finance so that developing countries can fulfill their role. We have witnessed during this year painful events in Pakistan, in the African continent, and in various parts of Europe and America. All these events and their destruction and impact represent a lesson to be learned and a sounding alarm all over the planet, a wake-up call inviting us to more precaution and to act quickly to take all necessary measures as per our commitments and pledges. Ladies and gentlemen, it is clear to all of us that our conference is held this year amid political tensions that left their deep impact on all our countries, namely the crises in energy and food supplies. If some people think that such challenges will hamper international collective action in the field of climate action, on the contrary, we here in Sharm el-Sheikh need to prove the contrary. That's why I invite you all to show the whole world that we are aware of the challenge awaiting us and that we have the political will to counter it. That's why we have constantly called for moving from negotiations and pledges to an era of implementation as a priority, as well as the acceleration of implementation of what we have agreed upon with the UNFCCC, promoted in the Paris Accord and the work program, while mentioning the importance of scaling up ambitions according to the country's capacities and natures of their resources. I would like to commend the countries that have updated their NDCs, including Egypt, and I represent you all. I trust I speak on behalf of all of you when I call upon countries to do the same, especially that the NDC synthesis report revealed that the current level of ambitions is not up to the Paris goals. In this context, it is worth mentioning that for the sake of an efficient implementation of pledges and commitments, we need a more efficient and wider participation by all relevant parties from non-state actors, whose role is equally important to that of the role of the states, namely private sector, banks, international finance institutions, civil society, youth associations, indigenous associations, and others. In this context, my country, Egypt, while preparing this conference, has been adamant on engaging in consultations with all these parties, including them in all events and meetings, be it pertaining to the presidency initiatives or thematic days, or also the preparations for the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Summit, which will start its meetings tomorrow at the level of heads of states and governments.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I assume my presidency of the COP, I draw your attention to two undeniable facts. First, climate change-related efforts over the past decades were remarkably polarized, which has slowed down progress of the negotiations. Second, the current mobilization efforts raise many concerns. The $100 billion a year pledge has not yet been implemented. Also, the financing currently available focuses on curbing emissions and not adaptation efforts. Also, most of the financing is based on loans. I believe that you agree with me when I say that we do not have the luxury of continuing in this way. We have to change our approaches to this existential threat. We have to work diligently and honestly and listen to one another, and also listen to the concerns of other parties and understand them. And also we have to work to reach consensual solutions that can be implemented, ones that prove that we are serious about not leaving anyone behind. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the threats we still face, humanity still has a chance to overcome this hard stage. That if we have the political will to work together in unison. Today, there are many proofs to this. For instance, renewable energy sector is witnessing an unprecedented forward leap. its prices are now remarkably lower. Also, the technologies of adaptation have also developed remarkably, and the past few years have seen an increased awareness amongst communities and amongst young people. They are now more aware of the threats posed by climate change and more determined to work with this issue innovatively and effectively. The contribution of civil society has also increased. People in think tanks have been mobilized, women have been mobilized, local governments as well have all been mobilized. This proves that we still have a chance to overcome this threat that actually jeopardizes the lives of millions all over Earth. Ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow, Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Summit starts. The leaders of the world will flock to this venue to express their commitment to face up to climate change and to work for a better future where we can live without this existential threat. Steps away from the venue where our leaders convene, 2 weeks of important negotiations and deliberations will start. These negotiations will hopefully be fruitful. I call upon all of you to listen carefully and to commit to implementation and to turn political commitment that will be expressed tomorrow and the day after into agreements and understandings and texts and resolutions that we can all implement. I call upon all of you to fully be aware that we are not just embarking on negotiations that are detached from reality. I would like to tell you that zero-sum games would have no winners. Our mission is much loftier than this. The implications and the effects of our work will affect the lives and livelihoods of millions of people around the world who have been suffering of the impacts of climate change. So we cannot afford any negligence or shortcomings. We cannot threaten the future of coming generations of our sons and grandsons and daughters. I am fully aware that you know the magnitude of the challenge and that you have the will to work to combat it effectively. It is high time that we worked and implement. Let's implement together for the sake of humanity and our planet. Thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you and for the success of this conference. Thank you.
Distinguished delegates, honored guests, colleagues, this morning we are honored to have with us Mr. Hossein Ghli, Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Mr. Simon Steele, UNFCCC Executive Secretary. It is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Simon Steele, UNFCCC Executive Secretary, to address the plenary.
Honourable guests, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you officially to COP27. Salam alaikum. I must thank my predecessor, Patricia Espinosa. We're all grateful for the valuable work you did over the last 6 years. Thank you to the outgoing COP president, el-Sheikh, and his able team for their leadership over the last 3 years. And I'd like to officially congratulate the Egyptian presidency and Minister Shukri for his election. Thank you for your tireless efforts as we work to make COP27 a success. Friends, today a new era begins, and we begin to do things differently. Paris gave us the agreement. Katowice and Glasgow gave us the plan. Sharm el-Sheikh shifts us to implementation. No one can be a mere passenger on this journey. This is a signal that times have changed. As Executive Secretary of the UN Climate Convention, it is an honor to be standing in a room of people dedicated to tackling humanity's greatest challenge. Every one of you brings a unique perspective. I come from Grenada, a state of 3 islands of Carriacou and Petit Martinique. Carriacou is my home, where my family live on a 13-square-mile island with a population of just 7,000 people. Our history is of seafarers, fishers, boat builders, farmers, surviving on their wits and the strength of their communities, working closely together. My roots lie in a life full of beauty and adversity. As a teenager, I became involved in the global issues of the day, the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the anti-apartheid movement. I joined demonstrations and protests. I was often told one person cannot make a difference. Well, Nelson Mandela said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." I hold that thought close to me. It always seems impossible until it is done. So this is why I say today, a new era begins, and we begin to do things differently. We will be holding people to account, be they presidents, prime ministers, or CEOs, an accountability chief, if you may, because our policies, our businesses, our infrastructure, our actions, be they personal or public, must be aligned with the Paris Agreement and with the Convention. The heart of implementation is everybody, everywhere in the world, every single day, doing everything they possibly can to address the climate crisis. There are those that are going forward further and faster than everyone else. These are examples that must be followed. There are those who just need a nudge into taking further action, to go beyond business as usual. There are others who need support so they are able to do the things they need to do for their countries and communities, specifically highly vulnerable nations. And then there are those who still refuse to act unless others do. They will not be allowed to slow down the collective process. Let's not let positioning block progress. All of us have to do everything we are capable of doing. And we have that opportunity over the next 2 weeks. Our COP process is unique. We must create a safe political space, shielded from whatever else is going on out there, to do our jobs and deliver world change. The geopolitical situation, the pandemic, the food and energy crises have hit countries, economies, and most importantly, individuals hard. But let me make this point to humbly remind all of those engaged in this process of a simple fact. For decades, communities all over the world, very often the most vulnerable people, have been dealing with the continuous stream of crises, facing impact after impact of climate change. This has stripped generations of their lives and livelihoods. So here, in Sharm el-Sheikh, we have a duty to speed up our international efforts, to turn words into action, to catch up with their lived experience. This is a party-driven process. Over the course of my term, I will be mobilizing the process and Secretariat to boost party's drive. This is my promise to you. I want you to focus on 3 critical lines of action. This is what I want you to deliver on. First, we must demonstrate this transformational shift to implementation, putting negotiations into concrete actions. Every corner of human activity must align with our Paris commitment of pursuing efforts to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Let's be encouraged by the strides that certain sectors are making on this, and let's look closer at how the global financial architecture can be made fit for purpose in line with the Paris commitments. The second line of action, we must cement progress on these critical work streams: mitigation, adaptation, finance, and crucially, loss and damage. We need to enable enhanced finance to flow to addressing impacts. What is said in these negotiating rooms has to be reflected in the urgency of what is happening outside. There are areas of commonality which we can lean into and build bridges upon. We must build those bridges. At this COP session, some processes will find themselves at a midway point. Others will be initiated, and there are some that will have to be revisited. Finally, our third line of action. We must enhance the delivery of the principles of transparency and accountability throughout the process. The environmental integrity and the reliability of the commitments made are paramount. I welcome detailed plans on how we deliver what we have promised across finance, adaptation, and mitigation. I found myself in my accountability chief role last week when we launched the NDC synthesis report, and I had to report that only 29 countries had come forward with tightened national plans since COP26. 29 is not 194. So here I am now, looking out at 165 countries that are due to be revisiting and strengthening their national pledges this year. I want to take a moment now to recognize the Glasgow Climate Pact. We made this agreement together only last year. I am not in a habit of rescinding on my word. I firmly expect all parties to act the same way. Stick to your commitments. Build on them here in Egypt. I will not be a custodian of backsliding. As the world pivots to implementation, women and girls have to be placed at the center of climate decision-making and action. Their empowerment leads to better governance and better outcomes, and we need that. This formal process is led by parties, by party states, but it is permanently inspired, challenged, and pressed into action by civil society organizations who not only advocate, but act on the strength of their convictions. I intend to listen closely to their voices, particularly those of the youth, making sure they can be clearly heard and, importantly, felt. Our COP process has delivered a remarkable transition in the consciousness of humanity, in the timeline of human development. Our minds have moved from researching to understanding and then to agreeing on a plan. To paraphrase the wonderful Nobel Prize-winning Egyptian writer Naguib Mahfouz, you can tell whether a person is clever by their answers. You can tell whether a person is wise by their questions. We have demonstrated the very best in human wisdom by asking the right questions. Now we know what must be done by everybody, everywhere, every single day, doing everything we possibly can. Colleagues, it's time to get to work. Shukran. Thank you.
Thank you, Executive Secretary. Distinguished colleagues, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. Recognizing the continued importance of the IPCC within the climate process as we begin COP27, I would like to invite Mr. Hossein Lee, Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to address the plenary. You have the floor, Mr. Lee.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, as the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, I'm delighted and honored to address you at the opening of COP27. We are very grateful to the Egyptian government and the presidency of COP27 for hosting this crucial conference. We also want to extend our thanks to the people of Sharm el-Sheikh for their warmest welcome and generous hospitality. Thank you. The voice of today's science on climate change could not be sharper, stronger, and more sobering. We are not on track today to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The time for our collective action is now. IPCC reports presented to the world in February and April this year clearly show that we have the technology and the know-how to tackle climate change. But these options are limited by the availability of finance, among others. Adaptation options are further limited by global warming levels. With increasing warming, losses and damages will increase, and additional human and natural systems will be pushed to adaptation limits. Therefore, the prerequisite to a successful adaptation is ambitious mitigation to keep global warming within limits, particularly 1.5 degrees Celsius, through immediate and deep cuts in the emissions of greenhouse gases. Progress on the financial flows comparable to the goals of Paris Agreement remains low. Accelerated international financial cooperation is a critical enabler of low emission and just transition. Adaptation gaps, especially in the developing countries, are particularly driven by widening disparities between the cost of adaptation and financing available to adaptation. We can achieve the greatest gains in well-being by prioritizing finance to reduce climate risks for low-income and marginalized communities. Since the Paris Agreement, many countries have put in place climate policies, and regulations. But their scope needs to be expanded, their ambition raised and implemented. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to save our planet and our livelihoods. Ladies and gentlemen and distinguished delegates, this is an opportunity as well as an obligation. The range of options and most of all, the time available to them now will not be there for future leaders and policymakers. Before closing, allow me to reassure you that the scientific community remains ready to work with you and support you in every step of the way in this journey to limit global warming and also for achieving sustainable development. Humanity, our planet, and species living on it deserve nothing less. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the opening statements of COP27. Delegates, please remain in your seats. We will continue with the first plenary meeting of COP27, followed by the first plenary meeting of the CPM17 and the first plenary meeting of the CMA4. Thank you very much. Distinguished delegates.